Good evening and welcome to the YouTube channel of Instituto Cervantes, Leeds and Manchester. My name is Pedro Eusebio. I am the director of Cervantes Institutes in those two cities. Muy buenas tardes, bienvenidos una vez más al canal de YouTube del Instituto Cervantes de Manchester y Leeds. Yo soy Pedro Eusebio, el director de estos centros en el norte de Inglaterra, y hoy me voy a permitir comenzar únicamente un par de minutos en español, puesto que estamos presentando un ciclo que trata sobre el bilingüismo y después pasaré a hablar en inglés. El ciclo, como saben una gran parte de las personas que nos siguen, trata de profundizar en las enormes ventajas que supone el dominio de varias lenguas, no solamente dos, tres, la multiculturalidad y el dominio de lenguas como una ventaja no solamente profesional, sino también psicológica, afectiva, en fin, es una manera de vivir muchas vidas cuando se hablan muchos idiomas. Para este ciclo contamos con la colaboración y la coordinación del profesor Dr. Julio Viarcius, que es el gran artífice de la idea y a que agradecemos una vez más. Buenas tardes, Julio, y muchas gracias por tu apoyo. Y esta tarde a nuestra invitada especial, a Irene de la Cruz-Pavía, que es profesora en la Universidad del País Vasco. Muchas gracias, Irene, también por acompañarnos y por aceptar la invitación. So, as I said, we are presenting our first meeting of the Bilingualism series of 2022. And since it is a program dealing with this great subject, the bilingualism, I took this today as the first day. I spoke in Spanish just a bit and to reinforce the idea that it's good to know different languages and there are always so many advantages. This series, for those who don't, maybe we have new people participating in this series, has a very clear aim, is to promote the idea of bilingualism as a great advantage for everybody, and that a language can be learned at any age. And the series has been possible due to the cooperation and support of Dr. Julio Viarcius, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester. Welcome, Julio, and thank you again. And today we have a special guest, Irene de la Cruz-Pavía, who is a researcher at the University of the Basque Country, Universidad del País Vasco, and she's also a member of the research group, the Bilingual Mind, as well as research fellow at the Basque Foundation for Science, Iker Basque. So thank you very much for both of you for accepting the invitation. As always, it's a great honor to have you tonight. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, this topic is very interesting, and also bilingualism is an advantage, as I said, but it poses a challenge for the families and also for the individuals. Which language should be used? When we should we start to speak to a foreign language to a child? How should we organize the educational system in Britain, in Spain, in every country? Because far from the received idea that bilingualism or multilingualism is something special in some regions of the world or many countries, the reality is the contrary. The countries, I don't think is there any country in the world where the people are monolingual. The vast majority of the countries in every continent live with several languages at the same time. When we add the fact that there are a new tendency in society with the great migration movements, with the multiculturalism, Manchester is a good example of that. So we have a city where more than 30 nationalities and more than 100 languages are represented. That is an immense richness, but at the same time, as I said, is a great challenge. So with this series, we try to to answer some of those questions. Well, some of the best specialists in the academia about bilingualism in Britain, Spain, in the United States, in many countries. And as I said, this is the first in our second year of this series, and we are very, very happy because in every lecture we have even more people participating. I will introduce very shortly our guest. As I said, Dr. Julio Viarcius is the coordinator of the series. Is a senior lecturer of Spanish in Spanish linguistics and syntax in the Department of Linguistics in an English language at the University of Manchester. And he is currently Maria Zambrano's senior research at his alma mater, the University of Oviedo in Asturias, in Spain. Dr. Villagarcia, in the course of his PhD at the University of Connecticut, was trained as a theoretical syntactician and as a language acquisitionist, working within the framework of minimalism. His current interests lie in the areas of Spanish Romance and English linguistics. Other interests include child language acquisition, bilingualism, and the application of theoretical linguistics research to foreign second language pedagogy. Our second guest, the special guest tonight, is Dr. Irene de la Cruz-Pavía. She obtained her PhD, in the linguistics at the University of País Vasco and continued her research career in the University of British Columbia in Canada, Université de Paris in France, and the Università degli Studi di Padova in Italy. Her research investigates how humans examines humans' abilities to process various types of linguistic structure from early infancy to the old age, in order to further our knowledge of how we acquire and process the grammar of our languages. She's currently leading a project in which she investigates the cognitive consequences of being bilingual. So it's a real pleasure, an immense honor to have you, Irene and Julio, tonight. But before I give the floor to Julio, I will inform you that our next event and next lecture in bilingualism will be on the 12th of April. You are very welcome, and that would be Professor Sylvia Montour from Illinois University, the professor who will give the lecture about bilingualism. So, without further ado, sin nada más que añadir, Julio, tienes la palabra.
Muchísimas gracias, Pedro. Thank you very much, Pedro. It's a real honor to still be coordinating this series in its second edition, which is great. And of course, this is thanks to the fact that the events are very well attended, live, and we also have a lot of people watching them afterwards on YouTube, which is a very welcome result. May I remind all of you to please keep the microphones muted during the session. Thank you very much. Pedro has already introduced our speaker. I will just speak personally, even though I don't know Irene, I just met her today, but it's a real honor to be part of this. Irene de la Cruz-Pavía is a very well-known researcher, even though she's still a relatively young researcher, right, who got her PhD just 10 years ago, which in the world of research is a very short time. So she can be considered junior, even though she's clearly senior. You know, her work is extremely impressive. She's the holder of an Iker Basque scholarship, which is one of the most prestigious across Europe. She has done wonderful things on language acquisition, and as she herself claims, babies acquiring language is the most impressive thing we can think of, right? So, well, it's a real honor. I'll give the floor to Irene, because we are here to listen to her. If you have any questions, please write them down, and I will be asking Irene during the Q&A or discussion period. So, well, Irene, it's a real honor. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Pedro, and the Instituto Cervantes of Manchester and Leeds for organizing this, and thank you everyone for being here. It's a real pleasure. So, Irene, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julio. Thank you, Pedro. Thank you, Instituto Cervantes. Actually, the pleasure is mine because I have watched all of the previous videos of the seminar, and I think it's a really lovely initiative. And so it is my pleasure to be able to talk about the topic that I love. So hopefully you will find this as interesting as I do. So I'm going to share my screen and hope that everything will work. Just a little moment. Sounds good. So I'm going to get started. As you might have all seen, the topic of my talk is the similar but different paths towards acquiring one or more languages. And so what I plan to do today is to talk a little bit about how infants acquire language and how that trajectory resembles when you're learning only one versus more, and in what sense does it differ? Of course, I'm not going to be super exhaustive because we only have about an hour, but hopefully I will get you a sense of the fact that actually this is a relatively similar trajectory and the differences are relatively minor, okay? And so this is not the first time that this topic has been covered. Actually, if you haven't done it so far, watch Kim Potowski's talk because it was so informative and so entertaining. However, the talks that up to now have covered this topic have covered it from the perspective of mostly school-age children, right? So these are kids that are 5, 6, 7 years and older, which means that by that time, they have acquired a big part of their languages already. What I am going to be talking about today is the truly earliest stages of language acquisition. That is, when do babies start to acquire their languages, when they are monolingual, when they are bilingual, and how do they do so, okay? And so first, I want to just give you a little thought about what it means to be bilingual. Again, this is not new. This has been covered in several of the previous talks, but it is a very important one. And so I want to, again, think about it a little bit. And what I want for you to think about is how difficult it is to define what it means to be bilingual, and actually how we do not have a definition for that. And so if we just go to the literature, to earlier literature, but to the literature, we'll see that there are many different definitions, and it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to actually have consensus on what it means to be bilingual. So we can define bilingual as the practice of alternating the use of two languages, whatever that means. How well you use them, how well you know them, doesn't enter into this equation. We can also define it as anyone who possesses a minimal competence in only one of their language skills, whether it is listening comprehensions, whether it's speaking, reading, writing in a language other than their mother tongue, which here implies that you only have one mother tongue, right? We can define it as well as being bilingualism is the capacity of the individual to speak in a second language, following the concepts and structures of that language instead of paraphrasing the mother tongue. Okay, so I guess instead of just translating word by word your language, but again, this is a definition that certainly doesn't cover every type of bilingualism, right? We can also define it as a speaker of one language that becomes able to produce complete meaningful utterances in another language. Okay, so what is meaningful? Is it just communicating? Does it have to be perfect? Does it have to be grammatically correct? Or having native control of both languages? So all of these different definitions, what I just want to show you is that depending on who you ask, they will consider bilingualism one thing or another. And it is actually the case that very often many people that are bilinguals because they can communicate in two languages would not define themselves as bilinguals because they do not think they have enough control in their second language. Just to have this in mind. And so, as I am mentioning, there are very different types of bilinguals. You can acquire a language, you can learn a language at school, right? Like we've seen, for instance, in Kim Potowski's talk, she was talking about some L1 English kids that would choose to learn Spanish at school from early on, right? In sort of like semi-immersive school classes. We can also decide to learn a language when we are adults, right? So you can decide that your dream has always to be able to speak some Korean, and so you go and take some classes as an adult. Or you can acquire it or learn it in a very different context, which is that of immersion. You can go to a place in which they speak a language you do not speak, and then you have to learn it, right? And you're immersed in that scenario. And that can be your choice, or you can be forced to just have to migrate wherever you are and go to a place and have to learn a language. You can also be lucky and have the situation in that in your house, you know, your parents can speak to you in more than one language. And so you get the chance to learn it from infancy. And there are even extraordinary cases, like the case, for instance, of adoptees that have been acquiring a given language, but then they are adopted and they move to a different country. And so they essentially reacquire a new language a little later on. So today I am going to speak about the very specific type of bilingual, and that is a crib bilingual. And by a crib bilingual, I mean a baby that since birth at home, their parents have talked in more than one language. And that is the type of acquisition I am going to be talking to you today, because that is, let's say, the one that resembles more what happens with the monolingual, right? So we acquire our language at home from our parents. So what I'm going to tell you is to what extent this trajectory changes when you're acquiring one versus more languages. Okay. And so, all right. So what are the tasks that infants need to accomplish when they acquire a language? Again, I just want to take a moment to think of this, because I don't think we very often stop and think about how tremendously difficult it is to acquire a language. Even if we ourselves have difficulties when we're adults trying to learn new languages, I just want you to think about how many different tasks infants need to accomplish and how difficult these are. So the first one is what we're going to call speech segmentation. What do I mean by this? What I mean is that when we talk, we actually do not insert pauses after each word. Our words are not separated when we talk. Lots of them are connected, and we only insert pauses here and there. And so how are we able to take this stream of sounds and divide it into units that make sense, like words, right? And so for us, it's easy because we know the words. So as soon as we hear them, we recognize them, and so we can shop this. But what happens with a baby that is born into the world, does not know the words of their language, does not know the sounds of their language, and they are hearing blah, 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 and they have to begin with that. So this is one of the very difficult tasks that infants need to accomplish, and they do it very efficiently and very fast. Another task that they need to do is discover what are the sounds of their language. We will talk about this later on. This is also not trivial because not every language shares the same sounds. I have put this example because I think it's very intuitive, which is the distinction between R and L, because we all know it's been talked about a lot that in certain languages, they belong to the same category. They do not discriminate senses. That means there are not two words that are going to mean different things depending on whether you use one or the other. But this exists in English. You can say right, you can say light, and these mean two different things. And the only difference between the two of them is which of these two sounds you're using. So your babies, when they're born into the world, need to figure out whether they are in a language in which these two sounds are the same thing, or whether they are in a language in which they are two different things, right? What else do they need to do? They need to acquire their lexicon. And what do we mean by their lexicon? We mean that they need to know what are the words of their language. But to do that, there are several steps that they need to do. They need to discover what sequence of sounds means something. So they have to know that this picture that you see here below on the right is a turtle. And that is how it's called in English. And in Spanish, instead, it is called tortuga, right? And so they have to know this. They have to discover that this is the sequence of sounds that you use to depict this specific thing. But they also need to discover what is the referent, what is it referring to, right? For instance, if they hear apple, they need to realize that what we are talking about is the fruit, not, for instance, the color red. So when we say apple, we are not referring to the fact that something is round or the fact that something is red. We are referring to a fruit, right? And so this is another thing that kids need to do. And think about the fact that we have thousands of words in every language, and kids learn them quite fast. Another thing that they need to do is learn the intonation or prosody of their languages. That is part of their sound system, right? What does this mean? We don't talk like robots. We don't talk like this, everything sounds the same, right? No, we talk with modulations. Our tone goes up, goes down, right? If we ask a question in certain languages, we will finish with the raise, right? Can you give me the keys, right? In other languages, they don't use this, but in some languages, they use this, right? Kids need to learn this. They need to learn that this intonation actually is going to help them distinguish meanings as well, right? Or understand whatever is being conveyed to them. What else? The grammar, arguably the most abstract part of a language, the rules of a language, right? The fact that we need to know that in English you say she is dancing, in not she dancing is. In which order do the words appear? It's not random, there are rules, we need to learn this. We also need to learn that in English you have to say she is dancing, you cannot say is dancing, but in Spanish you can say está bailando without saying who, right? all of these rules kids need to discover. And finally, one that I really like is pragmatics, which is the fact that the exact same words can have different meanings depending on the context. So I like very much this. Sorry, I hear myself with echo. I like very much this strip from the Seeds comic, in which Jeremy, which is the blonde kid you can see on the left, is telling his friends, band practice my house 6 to 8, and they are all telling him thanks for the reminder. And so in the last one, what you can see is the father of Jeremy telling his neighbors the exact same thing, and the neighbors replying the exact same thing. But what they are meaning is entirely different. Is band practice my house 6 to 8, scram, go elsewhere, do not be bothered, because they are going to be making noise, right? So that is another thing that infants and kids need to discover. Okay, so how come kids are able to do all of this so fast? Because think about it, kids usually acquire language in few years without an effort, and nobody is explicitly telling them the rule of word order in English is A and B and C, right? So they learn it just without nobody telling them the rules, right? How come they do it so quickly and so well? And particularly in the case of bilinguals, they have to do this for 2 languages and keep them apart, and they do it. So how do they do it? Well, one of the reasons why kids are so good at acquiring languages very early on is a question of biology mixed with experience. And so what do I mean when I say that? Here we have the development of a brain, right? While the baby is in gestation, so before being born. And so what the reason why we're so good at learning this is brain plasticity, plasticidad cerebral. What does this mean? So you know that our brain is built from brain cells, which are neurons, and our neurons have little arms that go out of them, and they have long arms, which are called axons, that are going to go and try and connect with other neurons, right? And so they connect via little fingers that are called synapses. And so what happens is that until the moment that we are born, unless we are exposed to toxins or something really weird, how this create is a matter of biology, is just predetermined genetically, right? When the child is born, what occurs is that in the first few years of life, there is an explosion of connections. We suddenly have many more connections. You can see this in the plot that I put below on the left. Here we can see the density of synapses that we see at birth. As you can see, it's quite sparse. There are lots of empty spaces. By the time they are about 6, 7 years of age, you can see it's so much more populated, right? Why is this? There's been an explosion. But then by the time they're around puberty, this has sort of been pruned. This has been trimmed. There are less. Why? Well, the way that I want you to think of infants and of humans in general is that we're very efficient machines. And so at first, we get this explosion because by having lots of possibilities, this allows us to learn everything we need to learn. But as the years progress and we have experience accumulated, it is not really worth our while to maintain all of these things activated that we are not using. If we don't use it, having it causes, that causes resources because we have to feed it. So it's really better to cut what you're not using. And so there is a descent of this plasticity up until puberty. And so this is why, part of the reason why it is so much easier for infants to acquire languages. We have, let's say, more wires to do so, okay? Okay, so what do we know about how we begin to acquire languages? When do we begin to acquire our native language? Well, we know that exposure to our native language begins in utero. What do I mean? What I mean is that infants in the 3rd trimester of gestation can already hear. Their hearing is operational. It's not as mature as later on, but it is enough that they can hear and they can actually learn from it. We will see it right now. And so, of course, we don't hear as if we were outside because there are all the maternal tissues, right, that are going to be creating sort of a barrier, right? But we can hear our mothers. So that you guys know, it's very difficult that they would hear the father or other people outside because they would really have to be shouting, but they can hear the mother because the voice resonates through the bones and through her body. And so the fetus is getting that sound. But it sounds muffled. It sounds as if right? If you have something covering. And so what the baby is hearing is actually the intonation or prosody of their language. That is the part that they're hearing. And as I said, not only do we hear, but we actually learn from this information. How do we know this? We know this from some studies, really old ones, really cool ones. I'm always amazed at researchers that before we had all of these computers and everything could actually devise ways of knowing these things. And so the Casper and Pfeiffer, what they did is they showed that babies at 2 or 3 days of age would recognize the voice of the mother and distinguish it from other women, and actually would prefer the voice of the mother to the voice of other women. And so this suggests that they were hearing it while before they were born. But of course, it can be that by day 2, maybe the mother has spoken enough that they have learned it. And so to test this further, they showed later on that actually, while babies at the same age can tell apart the voice of the father from other voices of males, they can discriminate them, they do not prefer them, right? And these were fathers that had been around for these 2-3 days of their lives. So they had heard them. And so this together comes to show that it seems that whatever experience they had with the voice of the mother before being born was enough to recognize it and prefer it. But another piece of evidence that I love, it's a study that I find beautiful, is one that they did a little later on, in which they had mothers that were pregnant read the same story aloud every day for the last, I think, 2 months of pregnancy. And at the moment that the kids were born, at day 2, 3, 4 of age, they were tested. They were played, either the mother, a recording of the mother reading this little story, or a recording of the mother reading another story. And the kids would recognize and prefer the one that the mothers had read during pregnancy, which means that they were able to recognize this intonation characteristic of the story they had heard many times before being born. Okay, so this is very impressive. But now the next question is, okay, but do we learn anything about our native languages? And so we know that we do. And before I tell you what we know, I'm going to tell you how we know, because I think this is lovely, which is a method that was devised in the 70s by Peter Amos called high amplitude sucking. So what it does is it capitalizes on essentially the only thing we can measure in a newborn, which is, well, unless we measure their brain activity, which is their sucking patterns, right? They cannot talk, they cannot point, they cannot really look anywhere. Well, they can, but sort of, but they can suck, and they do it reflexively. And so what this person did is they, while they were in the hospital, the baby's in the crib comfortable, and so they give them a pacifier, a soother, and it's connected to a computer. And every time the baby sucks, the computer records how big the suck is. And so what they do is they create a threshold, and anything that is bigger than that threshold is considered a high amplitude suck, a big suck. And so what they do in the study is then, whenever the baby delivers a big suck, speech plays. And so what is the idea here? First of all, that babies love speech, and so they suck more. And secondly, that babies quickly learn that they control when they hear things, which is incredible, but it is true. They, in 1 to 3 minutes, these newborn babies learn that if they suck, something plays. And so what did they do? They tested babies that were 2 days old. And what they did is they presented them with a language that was not the language that they spoke. And so they divided their study in 3 parts. In the first part, they were listening to this language. And at first, the babies are randomly, everything is silent. They are sitting in their crib and they have the suck, the pacifier, they suck on it, and suddenly something starts playing in a language they don't know. And then a couple of seconds passes, they suck again, sounds again. They start picking up on the fact that when they suck these sounds, so what occurs is that typically they like it, and so they suck more and more and more. And so that's why towards the middle of the study, you see an increase. But then what happens is that eventually, if you keep on going, they get bored. And so towards the end of the study, they drop, right? This is what happened when the kids were hearing a language that was foreign to them. What happened when they heard a language that was their native language? What happened is that they would not get bored. They would just keep on sucking, right? And so what happened here is that what this tells us is that they prefer to listen to their native language, which means that they recognize their native language at 2, 3 days, 4 days of age, okay, which I think is quite impressive. Okay, and so how about bilinguals? This is what monolinguals do, but how about bilingual babies? Well, this is what Krista Byers-Heinlein, and colleagues decided to investigate. And so what they did is they tested 2 groups, a group of infants that had only heard English, so similar to what we saw before, only one language, and a group of infants that had heard English and Tagalog, which is a language spoken in Philippines, okay? So the mothers during pregnancy were speaking both of them, and before they were born, the babies were hearing both of them. And so what they found is that when you take the babies that only heard English and you present them both languages, they prefer English, as we expect. But when you take bilingual babies, they prefer equally both their languages. They would suck as much while hearing both their languages. And so this suggests that they prefer the two languages. But of course, there is an alternative explanation, which is maybe they just don't know that there are two languages and they think that's only one. And so they're just, mixing both of them. This is the next question that they wanted to answer. And so to answer this, what they did is a slight manipulation of the study that I told you. What they did is what they call habituation, which means that they presented them with one language until the babies were born. So you see the curve that I showed you earlier, they start, in silence, start sucking, recognize that something happens, suck a lot. This is why the curve goes up, but eventually they get bored. And so they start sucking less, right? And so when they do this, when they start sucking less, what they did with their kids is divide them in two groups. One of the groups continued to hear the same language. Imagine they were hearing English, they continued to hear English. The kids, what happened in tests? They kept on being bored. So they kept on not sucking. But then the other part of the bilinguals had been bored with English, but then they switched to Tagalog. And what happened here? That suddenly kids recognized the difference and started sucking a lot. And so what does this show us? That they actually could tell their two languages apart. So it is not the fact that they thought Tagalog and English were a blur that was the same language. No, what happened is that they could tell that there were two different languages. So what do we learn from these studies? We learned that bilingual acquisition actually begins before we are born, okay? And language acquisition in general begins before we are born. All right, what is it that of our languages that allows us to do this that I found to be amazing? Well, actually, as I said, the thing that comes, the thing that you can hear while you are still in gestation is the intonation of your language, right? And so one aspect of this prosody or intonation of your language is the rhythm, which is the rhythmicity, the periodicity at which things happen. And so this has been studied for decades and decades. And the languages in the world are divided in classes depending on their rhythm. And so traditionally, since the 50s, there has been a distinction in two types of languages. On the one hand, we have what they call stress time languages, on the other hand, syllable time languages. What do I mean by this? Stress times are languages like English, Dutch, German. These languages, the rhythm is, let's say, a sequence of units that are strong and units that are weak. Strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak. And so an analogy that they use that I think is quite nice is they call it Morse code rhythm, because you have units that are long and short, but here you have units that are strong and weak, right? On the other hand, we have languages that are called syllable time, like Spanish, French, Italian, and those were defined, or those were described as machine gun rhythm, because what you have is all syllables that sound the same, equal strengths. And actually, I think this is quite accurate, because when I speak Spanish at my rhythm in Canada, they used to tell me I sounded like a machine gun. So, and years later, so the languages of the world were split into these two classes until many years later, they discovered there was a third one, which is the one of languages such as Japanese and Korean. I'm not gonna give you an analogy because I don't have a nice one, but I hope to illustrate what makes them go into one or another language. So there's been a lot of work on this, and it's not settled, but a good approximation to what makes a language go in one class or another is the distribution of vowels and consonants. So what do we have here? Let's look at English. We have the next local elections will take place during the winter. This is a stress time language. What you have below is C means consonant, V means vowel. It means the distribution of consonants and vowels that are in this sentence. And so what you have is that you can see that sometimes you have 1, 2, 3, and up to 4 consonants in a row, right? In between two vowels, right? So you have a lot of variability, whether you have few or many consonants in between two vowels. If you look into Italian, which is syllable time, and you have the same sentence translated into Italian, and you have the same translation into consonants and vowels, now you can tell that actually this distribution is different, right? Now you don't get 4 consonants in a row, you get at most 2 consonants in a row, right? So it's more balanced, this distribution of consonants and vowels. And if you go further down to Mora time and you go to Japanese, what you see now is there is almost a 1 by 1, 1 consonant, 1 vowel. So this is what one of the things that we think is responsible for this division in classes. Why am I telling you all of this? Well, I am telling you all of this because all of this that sounds so complicated is something that actually newborn infants do instinctively from birth. Let me show you what I mean. Newborns are able to discriminate 2 languages that have different rhythms from birth, even if they've never heard them before, as long as they have different rhythm. So there are plenty of studies looking at this. And so we have that, for instance, a French monolingual infant, a French infant that has only heard French during gestation, at the moment of birth, can tell apart English and Japanese. Has never heard these two languages, but they belong to different classes. Incidentally, to a different class as well than French. It can also discriminate English from Spanish, again, because they belong to different classes. One is Morse, the other is machine gun, right? It can also discriminate English from Italian, against Morse code versus machine gun, but it cannot discriminate English from Dutch. Why? Because both of them are Morse code languages. So we are born with this ability to discriminate languages that have different rhythms. And what about bilinguals? Do bilinguals have the same ability? They do. We saw it in the study that I presented just before. A newborn infant that is bilingual can discriminate English from Tagalog, which belong to different classes. So at the moment of birth, we can do this, whether we are bilingual or monolingual. But what happens with languages from the same class? What happens with English versus Dutch? When do we get to do this? Well, in that case, we achieve this by 4 or 5 months of age, which I think is pretty impressive. We can discriminate our native language from another language that is from the same rhythmic class. How do we know this? There are a number of studies showing that an English baby will be able to discriminate English versus Dutch, and even British English versus American English, which I think is even more impressive, right? Similarly, an infant that is acquiring Spanish can discriminate it from Catalan and from Italian. And the same if you're acquiring Catalan, right? And how about bilinguals? Same thing. Basque and Spanish, even though they are extremely different languages in many aspects, rhythmically they're relatively close, they belong to the same class. And so actually there's a study by Molnar and colleagues that shows that Basque and Spanish bilinguals can discriminate their two languages, and both of them from Italian, around 4 months of age. So this shows us that actually they are following the same trajectory, right? We are actually being able to discriminate rhythmically distant languages at birth and close languages by 4 or 5 months of age. But is everything identical in monolinguals and bilinguals? It actually isn't. When we present infants that only know one language with their language versus another language, they, let's say, react faster to their language. When you take a bilingual infant and you present them with either of their two languages or a new language, they're actually faster to orient to the new language, presumably because the other two are still in the process of separating, right? Which means that, are we achieving the same milestones at the same age? Yes. Are we doing this slightly differently? Yes. Does it have any consequence? Not whatsoever. It's just a fact, okay? All right, so now we've seen the first big ability that kids are born with. Let's move on to the next one, which is that, this I found very impressive, infants not only discriminate languages based on how they sound, but they can also discriminate languages only based on how they see, how they look, right? How do we know this? There was a series of studies by Whitney Wycombe and colleagues in which what they did is they took a bilingual speaker that could speak English and French. It was Canadian. And so what they did is they created videos telling the same story in both languages. And they presented these videos to English monolingual babies, okay? And what they found was that these babies, only by seeing the videos, no audio, could tell apart when it was speaking in English, when it was speaking in French, at 4 and at 6 months of age. But at 8 months of age, they had lost this ability, okay? Remember, we're at first open to everything, and then we will see it later on, we will specialize in what's important for us. What happens with bilinguals? They tested infants that were bilingual speakers of the two languages. And what they found is that these bilingual infants could discriminate English and French only by seeing them at 6 and at 8 months. So both monolinguals and bilinguals had the same ability, but bilinguals were retaining this ability longer. Why? Well, there is a lot of work showing that visual information is very important for us to process speech. Of course, we do not need it because we can speak on the phone and there is no problem, right? But now I think everybody intuitively, since the pandemic, understands that when we have visual information, we just understand better, right? There is a lot of work, including my own, showing that infants actually pay great attention to visual information from very early on, and it will help them acquire a number of things. It can help them, for instance, sort out the sounds of their language. And so the reason why we think bilinguals is paying more attention is because it's another type of information that is useful for them to tell their two languages apart. While in the case of monolinguals, because they only have one, and it is sort of redundant with what they hear, they don't need to rely that much on it. This is what we think is happening. Another study that I thought looked into this very nicely is a study by Nuria Sebastián Galles and colleagues. And they asked the following question. These bilingual babies discriminate their two languages, only in visual information, but would they be able to discriminate languages they don't know? And so what they did is they tested 8-month-old infants with the same videos. But these infants were not learners of English or French. They were learners of first Catalan or Spanish, monolingual infants, and then a group of bilingual infants that were learning both. So these babies have never seen English, have never seen French. And the question is, can they tell them apart? And so what they found was that monolingual infants could not tell them apart, but bilingual infants could, even though they had never seen these two languages. So it is not only that they could discriminate their languages visually, it's that they can discriminate languages visually, okay? And so bilingual infants, but not monolinguals, at 8 months can discriminate two unknown languages that have different rhythms just by seeing them. So it seems that this is another piece of information showing us that bilinguals pay more attention to visual information than monolinguals. And this is not the only one we have. We actually know that monolinguals and bilinguals scan the faces of the people who talk to us differently. So how do we know this? Imagine when you're seeing a speaker and somebody is talking to you, right? You can be looking at their eyes, you can be looking at their mouth. Where do babies look? This is a series of studies by David Lefkowitz and later on his collaboration with Ferran Pons, in which what they did is they created a video in which they just had a speaker speaking, saying a story or a little paragraph in a language. And they tested monolingual infants at different ages to see their trajectory. And what they found is that at 4 months of age, infants typically look at the eyes of whoever is talking to them. By the time they're 8, there has been a switch such that now they're paying more attention to the mouth. Why? Because this is the time at which they are actually learning about the sounds of their language. We will talk about it right now. And so by the time they're 12, they have more or less learned sort of most of the sounds in their language. And so they split their time looking at the eyes and the mouth. What happens with bilinguals? With bilinguals, what occurs is that they begin as monolinguals, they switch to the mouth, but then they spend longer time at the mouth. Why? Because of course they have to learn two sound systems, they have to keep their language separate, and the mouth provides more information because it's giving you information about the sounds that you are producing, right? Because you're using your tongue, you're using your yaw, you're using your lips to articulate the sounds. And this helps infants. Whereas the eyes are crucial because they will give you all sorts of emotional information, etc., right? But it seems that at the moment, the task that they need to accomplish is to sort their languages and to learn the sounds. And so they focus on the mouth. Okay, so now that we talk about this, let's go a little bit more into how we acquire the sounds of our language. As I said, this is not trivial. Different languages have different sounds. You have to discover which ones are important in your language. And this is not an easy task because there is a huge difference across languages from how many sounds a given language has. I think the lowest one has 11 sounds in the world and the highest one has 141. So imagine that you have to discover that your language has 141 sounds that are all different. So think about a little baby having to accomplish this task. How do we do so? Well, we know that we are born sort of, well, this is being sort of universal phonetists. What do I mean by this? What I mean is that when we are born, we are able to discriminate a lot of sounds that later on we might not be able to discriminate. It's like we are open for everything. As I said, we are ready to learn anything, and then we will see what we need. And so we are able to discriminate things that later on as adults we cannot. We know this from beautiful work by Janet Worker and Richard Tees, which they did in the 80s, which was, it revolutionized our field, in which they, what they did is they wanted to understand whether we can or cannot discriminate things as babies, right? So they took this contrast, which is for us in English and in Spanish, it's T. We don't make this distinction, but in Hindi, this is a distinction that exists. And they have T that is dental, in which you put the tip of your tongue right behind the teeth, or you can produce it as a retroflex in which you put the tip of your tongue curved backwards on the palate, right? Like T, I cannot produce it. And so this is a distinction that English adult speakers cannot do. But in Hindi, it distinguishes meanings, right? And so they wanted to see what will an English baby, an English learning infant, what will they do? Will they be able to tell them apart? So what they did is they tested infants that were Canadian learners, Canadian English learners, And they tested them at 6 months. And they found out that at 6 months of age, infants could distinguish the two sounds. But very interestingly, by 8 to 10 months of age, now only some of these infants could do it. And by 12 months, essentially none could anymore. Why? There's been lots of work behind this. This is one of the best known things in our area. And this is that during the first year of life, we have what is known as a perceptual reorganization, meaning that, as I told you earlier, we come to the world open to learning anything. We have the capacity to discriminate sounds. We are able to learn whatever. But as we are gathering information about our language, as we keep on accumulating input, we start realizing that some things are relevant and others are not. And because we are efficient machines, why are we going to keep something open that we don't need? So what we do is we specialize in the sounds that are relevant for us. And so we get better at telling those apart, but as a consequence, we get worse at telling apart other sounds that are not relevant for us. Not all of them, but most of them, okay? And so by 12 months of age, what happens is that babies have mostly learned the sound system of their language. And what about bilinguals? When do they learn the sound systems of their two languages? Well, I like very much this example because it's quite, well, at least for me, it's difficult, which is, let's think about the distinction of B and P. If we think about it in French, which sounds essentially like in Spanish, we have that B sounds like B and P sounds like P, right? So batata, patata. But if we are producing this in English, this actually doesn't sound like this because you don't say patata, you say patata, right? So there's like a little aspiration. And actually, what we produce as a B does not exist in English because our P in French, our P in Spanish is actually the B in English. This is a little bit confusing. Do not worry. What I'm trying to convey is this distinction of these two sounds is actually different in English and in French. When does a bilingual baby learn this? Well, there was a study by Burns and colleagues that showed that at 10 to 12 months of age, infants that are only learning English only can do the distinction between the two sounds that are relevant in English. Whereas a baby that is acquiring English and French at the same age can tell them all apart. So by that time, they have even discovered this distinction between ba and pa and pa and pa in English and French, which means that they are essentially following the same trajectory. There are, again, certain differences, and there have been some studies that fail to show exactly the same pattern, but in general, it seems that the trajectory of monolinguals and bilinguals is similar. Okay, we have seen how we discriminate languages, our first ability. We have seen how we acquire the sound system of our language. Let's go into how we learn words. First of all, very briefly, what is the trajectory? It's around 6 months of age. We know that infants begin to recognize a few words. They can be their name, the name by which you call your mother, let's say mommy or mom, and a few more. Of course, it doesn't mean that they know exactly what they mean, but they can recognize it. They're very frequent, and so they can use these words. By 12 months, infants typically produce their first word, which can be completely unintelligible, or it can happen earlier, or it can happen later, because there is a huge variability. So do not stress if your baby doesn't produce their first word at 12 months. By 18 months, it is estimated that kids know about 50 words. And then is when what is known as the vocabulary spurt or the vocabulary explosion happens, which is that infants begin to learn a lot more words very quickly. And they begin to use words, and you're surprised because suddenly they're rapidly, there is a big increase in their knowledge of words. So that by the time they're 2, they know a few hundred words, okay? How do they do this? Well, one of the great abilities that they have is that they're very quick at mapping labels and objects. What do I mean? As I said earlier, to learn a word, you have to do a couple of things. First, you have to discover what are the specific sounds that put together refer to what I am talking about. So if I am trying to talk about the bear, I will say bear in English or also in Spanish, right? They then have to discover what is the reference. So what am I talking about when I say bear? Am I talking about toy? Am I talking about the color? Am I talking about the size? Am I talking about the animal, right? And kids have to put this together. We're actually extremely fast at doing this, so much more than you would think. And we know this from a series of studies, once again by Janet Worker, because she's just fantastic, in which what she did is she created these two objects that you can see that are colorful, but you could not really use a word to describe them because they don't really exist, right? So they gave them random words. One of them was leaf, the other one was neem. So what she did is she took some infants and made them listen to this for a little while. A little while is a couple of minutes. And afterwards, what she did is she presented one of the objects, but with the label of the other one. So she misnamed them. And what occurred is that by 14 months of age, infants would recognize, after only having heard these labels and seen these objects for a couple of minutes, they would recognize that this was the wrong name, which means that very quickly they had mapped the label with the object, okay? And even more impressively, by 17 months, they can do this even when the two labels only differ in a single sound, like bin and tin, which is really impressive. And so is this only true for monolingual infants? No, this is true for bilingual infants as well. We, monolingual or bilingual, are really fast at mapping labels and objects. It doesn't mean that they now know what this means. They haven't created the concept. It means that they have learned to associate the label and the object, which is, let's say, the beginning towards acquiring your lexicon. Then they will have to learn, all of the other aspects of it. But as always, as I've been trying to convey all along, that the milestones are the same, but the process is different at times, right? So what is different here in word learning between monolingual and bilinguals? Well, one of the things that we know is different is their use of the mutual exclusivity principle. And what is that, you might ask? Okay, so this is an assumption that we have that every object or each object is going to have a single label. There is only going to be a name to depict a thing. This is a way for us to disambiguate, right? And so this is an assumption that we have at 17, 18 months of age. We operate under this assumption, which means that if I give you these two images and you know what bear is, and now I tell you, look at the leaf, because you know the other one is a bear, you will automatically assume that leaf means the object I do not know, okay? So this is a principle, as I say, that we use at 17, 18 months, because it helps us build our vocabulary, right? But interestingly, this is not the case for bilinguals and trilinguals. They use it much less, and trilinguals actually might even not use it, depending on what you're doing. Why? Because this is true for a baby that only has a label to refer to one thing. But bilinguals and trilinguals, by 17, 18 months of age, are very well aware that bear is bear, but it's also oso. And therefore, when you give them a new word, they might assume that maybe it's depicting, it's a new label for the same thing, and I just didn't know it, okay? And actually, another way of looking into this that I thought was quite nice is the fact that if you give only the known object to these babies, and you say something like, what a nice leaf, right? A bilingual baby is going to assume that this is another way of saying bear, whereas a monolingual infant will think maybe they're talking about the color, or maybe they're talking about another property, right? So this shows us that while we're equally fast at mapping labels and reference, we actually seem to use different strategies. Why? Because we are efficient, and we won't use a strategy that is not useful to us. And for bilinguals, mutual exclusivity is not as useful as it is for monolinguals, so we abandon it, or we use it to a lesser degree, okay? So now we have seen a little bit about how we map, and now I just want to talk about building our vocabulary. Building our vocabulary. So this is one of the things that people worry a lot, right? About, is my bilingual baby going to know less words? And so, as I said earlier, we know that infants at 18 months of age know about 50 words, and by 2 years of age, they know about a few hundred, right? How do we know this? We know this because we use other measures, but very often we use questionnaires such as the CDI MacArthur-Bates questionnaire, in which what you do is essentially ask parents that have kids at a given age, how many of these words would you say your kid produces or understands? So, and they mark them. And so you can get a sense of what is the vocabulary of the kid. And there is actually lots of work showing that this is reliable, and it's extensively used. Okay, so what is the vocabulary of a monolingual and of a bilingual? So this is a study by Laura Bosch and Ramon Casas. So what they did is they investigated infants that were monolingual or bilingual at 18 months of age. Remember that at 18, I said that roughly you know about 50 words. So if you look into the left part of this graph, you will see that the outmost left bar depicts the vocabulary of these kids that were tested in Spanish, and it is around 50 words. If you look at the one that is right next to it, this is the total vocabulary size of kids that were only learning Catalan, and it's roughly a little lower, but roughly the same. It's just few babies, so there's variability. And the one that has the orange arrow right next to it is the mean of the two of them. So you see that they know around 45, 50 on average monolingual kids, as is to be expected at 18 months. In the right-hand side, we see bilinguals. I just want you to focus on the one that has the orange arrow. And so these are kids that have been learning or acquiring Spanish and Catalan at the same time. And we have that when you look at their total vocabulary size, that is their vocabulary size in Catalan and Spanish added, they know more words than monolingual kids. Because it is unfair to compare how many words they know in Catalan versus how many words a monolingual infant knows in Catalan, because a bilingual child is acquiring 2 languages, and you don't always necessarily give them the 2 labels in the 2 languages for every single thing. It might be that the verb you only always call oso, right? And so in order to get a true sense of how many words they know, you really have to adapt their 2 languages. And when you do that, turns out bilinguals have the same amount of words as monolinguals or more. So they do not have a poorer vocabulary, okay? But one thing that is interesting is that few studies have shown that they are slower to recognize them than monolinguals. Again, milliseconds has no consequence, but you keep on seeing slight differences. Why? Because they have to search in a bigger space, let's say, right? They have more words. They have to, it takes them a little longer to retrieve the word. And so they're a little bit slower. Does it make any difference? No. But again, here is a little difference in a trajectory that is otherwise similar. Okay. And now I want to tell you about the very last thing. I see it's 8, so I'm doing fine, which is a little bit about grammar. So we've seen language discrimination. We've seen how we acquire the sounds of our language. We've seen how we acquire the lexicon of our language a little bit. And now we're going to see a little about rules of our language. And we're going to talk about word order, right? Because word order is a main aspect of the grammar of a language. How do we order the words in our language? We cannot arrange them in any way, right? Well, in some languages you sort of can, but in most languages you can't. And so we're going to talk about what we call basic word order, and that is the order of the verb and the object. And the languages of the world is split into 2. Roughly half of them have an order in which the verb comes first, like in Spanish or in English. You say eat chocolate. And the other half of languages, instead, you say chocolate, eat. Chocolatea, han, for instance, in Basque, okay? And so this distinction actually goes hand by hand with a lot of other little things related to word order. For instance, we have that in English, we say a house, but in Basque, we would say it the other way around. And so what happens is that what we're doing is we're putting all of these grammatical words that don't mean really anything in a different place. So what do I mean by these grammatical words that I'm going to call functors? I'm talking about determiners or prepositions like in, of, right? Been, which don't really have a meaning. It's not like house that you can picture, right? But they help us build the rules, the structure of our languages. And so we have that in languages that have the verb first, these grammatical words, these functors come first. And in languages in which the verb comes last, these functors typically go last. And so one of the questions that Judith Gervain and colleagues wanted to ask is, when do kids begin to learn this? When are they able to discover this distinction, right? And so what they did to look into this is they created an invented language. And so this invented language had 2 types of units. One type was the ones that you can see in bold, ge, and fi, which occurred a lot. Why? Think about it. How often do you use the word house in a given day? Maybe once, twice. How often do you use a in a given day? 1,000 million times, or the, or in, or of, right? These grammatical words actually occur extremely frequently when we talk. Whereas nouns, because there are so many more, we use them less often. And so this is a cue that is present in the signal and that we actually know kids are extremely good at picking up to. And so this is what Judith Gervain and colleagues wanted to test. They wanted to see whether kids or when kids would be able to use this information to discover the word order of their language. And so they created this invented language. And as I said, they put together, sometimes there were very frequent elements like ge and fi occur all the time, and the rest were much less frequent. So maybe for every 5 ge, you had 1 fo, okay? And so they wanted to see what will an infant do with this. And you could cut this in 2 ways. You could cut this in a way in which you put the frequent element at the beginning, like you would do in English, like a house, or you can cut it in a way in which you actually put the frequent element in the end, like in Basque, right? And so they presented this language that is ambiguous, that could be cut in either way, to English infants that were learning, to the 8-month-old infants that were learning English. And what they found is that when they gave this language that is ambiguous and could be cut either way to these babies, they prefer to interpret this as if the frequent elements came first, which means that by now, they knew that in their language they came first, and if you give them something ambiguous, they would try and parse it as if it were their language. And when they chose infants, in this case they were Japanese, sorry, I don't know why I put the Basque flag. These were Japanese infants who are who in their language have frequent elements in the end, they actually divided this language in the opposite pattern. What do I mean by this? I think this was a little bit more confusing. What I mean is that by 8 months of age, these infants knew already whether in their language these frequent elements come first or last. So they had discovered already a huge part of their word order that can then help them learn about verbs and objects and other phenomena, okay? By 8 months of age. And what about bilinguals? Think about bilinguals. Frequency really doesn't help them because in one of their languages, the frequent element comes at the beginning, but in another of their languages, it might come at the end. And so they cannot really use this, right? Well, turns out that languages are very wise and they have another way of distinguishing these two word orders, and it's their intonation. Turns out that in languages like English, like Spanish, in which the frequent elements come at the beginning, there's usually a specific intonation in which you have a short, long thing. So it's shorter and house is longer. But in languages that are in which the verb comes last and in which the frequent element comes at the beginning, sorry, at the end, actually they don't use this intonation. They use a different one in which you have a high, low, right? And so what Gervain and Worker, who joined forces, discovered is that 8-month-old infants that are bilingual learners of the two languages only by listening to the prosody can tell the two orders apart. If you give this ambiguous language and you put the prosody characteristic of their VO language, they would carry it into their VO language. But if you gave them the prosody characteristic of their OV language, they would carry the same language in an opposite way. Which means that by 8 months of age, using this frequency, using this prosody, they already had discovered the word order of their two languages, okay? So this is the last part that I wanted to talk to you about. So I'm just going to do a very short recap. What did we learn today? We learned that infants, mono and bilingual, have the same language discrimination abilities at birth, but we have seen that bilinguals pay greater attention to visual information later on, right? We've seen that they rely to a greater extent in visual information because it's more useful for them. What else have we seen? We've seen that by the end of the first year, infants that are mono and bilinguals know most of the words, of the sounds of their languages, okay? Or all, depending. We know that by 14 to 18 months, monolinguals and bilinguals can very quickly map a new label with a new object, but bilinguals rely less on mutual exclusivity. They do not think that a new object, a new label will refer to a different object. It can be a second way of naming this. We have seen that by 18 months, bilinguals know at least as many words in their two languages combined as monolinguals in their single language. Okay, so they do not know less. When you combine them, they know the same or more. And we have seen that as young as 7-8 months of age, bilinguals can use the intonation of their languages to discover the word order. And monolinguals don't need to use intonation. They can rely on other things, but mono and bilinguals already have discovered this rough word order in their languages. And that is all I wanted to tell you today. I hope you enjoy this, and I am happily awaiting your questions.
Thank you so much, Irene. Still processing all this interesting information. It's been lovely. So, well, let's give Irene a round of virtual applause. And let's allow her to take a breather for 5 seconds before we bombard her with all these interesting questions that we're going to be asking. Thank you so much, Irene, really. And well, your enthusiasm is contagious. I think that as a researcher and as a teacher is crucial. Not everybody.
Yeah, I did tell you there's nothing more beautiful than babies acquiring language. There's just nothing.
I concur. I certainly agree. So some people apologize, they had to leave and they wanted to ask you questions, but hopefully they will email you once they watch it online later on. So the floor is open for questions now. And there is actually a question coming very timely by Glikeria Skamakki. My phonology is probably impeccable in this language. Kidding. The question is, how come some bilingual kids forget one of the languages later on in their lives?
Yeah, so this is So the thing about knowing languages is that you have to have exposure to them, you have to use them. This is not like learning to ride a bike or learning to tie a shoe. It's not procedural memory. It's not something that once you have learned, you will not forget. You still have to use them. Before we started, I was talking about this precisely with Pedro and Julio about the fact that I learned German as a child, but now it's been 10 years. And so I'm so rusty. You really need to use it. And so what happens, and this is something that Kim Potowski talked about as well, is that you gotta have exposure. So if you're a child and you're being raised, let's say in Catalonia, then you're lucky because you're exposed to Spanish and Catalan around you. And so you will have both of them. But for instance, when I was in Paris, I would talk to lots of parents who were who had immigrated. And so they were in a situation of immersion in which their language was not spoken except for them. And so what is very often the case, that kids at first only acquire the language of their parents, but then they start going to school. And so they start only learning French, and all of their friends speak only French, and they only speak French with them, and they watch TV in French, and eventually the parents know French. And so they are lazy. And so like, why am I going to make the effort of speaking this language that I don't speak with anybody else, right? And so they stop, or they reduce more and more their use, and the less they use it, the less they know it, right? So that it goes away forever. You can reclaim it, but it is true that you need to have exposure. So in these type of situations, I would always recommend, if you could manage to find some friends that have kids that also speak this language, then you can do like social things. It's not only you at home, but you can do like social things in which you only speak that language, and then maybe this is reinforcing. So that's why kids forget. They won't forget if they have exposure to it, but they have to have exposure.
Absolutely, Irene. And there's the issue of the language, as I like to call it, right? The language of social success, right? That's what you're describing. French would become the paramount language to the detriment of the other, unfortunately, right? So we need to try to strike this balance, even though there's no perfect balanced bilingual, right? But absolutely. So language maintenance, even in the household, is important. Children need to know that they can interact in that language and that it's useful. It has a purpose, right?
Absolutely. Yes. And as you say, there is a matter of prestige or not, or even of integration, right? Depending on where, so it is very different. It is very different. Somebody that comes from, let's say, I don't know, a rich country and comes into a place and they have their language, from somebody that immigrates from a poor place. They think they have to integrate and very quickly. And so very often what happens is that they think that this is easier for the kids if they integrate as fast as possible. I think this perception is changing, but it certainly was the case years ago, right? And then in order to facilitate the life of these kids, they are just, you know, not as soon as they can speak in the majority, in the prevailing language, they switch to that because that gives them an asset to integrate. But of course, if you instead come from a, you know, if you are, I don't know, a Swedish speaker, maybe you don't feel that pressure because you are well integrated. And so you don't have to do that and you can maintain it at home. And so it is very important that they have systems of support to be able to use their languages.
Excellent. Another question by Monica Mateo reads as follows. This is very interesting. I really like the part about word order, but why do you think bilingual children in English and Spanish mix this and say, for example, verde casa instead of the target casa verde?
I mean, it can happen. So first of all, word order varies, right? Like in Spanish, you can put the adjective in some context before and after. So both of them are correct. So they have to figure out which is the correct context and what is the rule to placing them correctly, right? So this is not automatic in a sense that it's not like you learn one thing about word order and you know them all. Some of them are more nuanced. In some languages, word order is very strict. In other languages, it is not. For instance, in Basque, it's a language that has one order that is canonical, but it's a free word order language, which means that you have a lot more liberty at arranging words than, for instance, in English, right? And so this is something that kids need to figure out. So specifically that example doesn't surprise me precisely because this is something that varies in Spanish. And so they have to learn it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Kate Santo congratulates you on a fantastic talk and asks the following question. Given how early infants acquire those language fundamentals like phonetics, do you think a person who starts learning a language at 5, 10, or 20 years of age can ever be actually bilingual? I know bilingual is just a word and different people understand it differently, but I'd love to hear your views on this.
Well, I'm going to actually make you very happy. A few years ago, Steven Pinker and Hawthorne was the first author, did a mega study with hundreds and thousands of people using, of course, online studies. And so it was a very crude, very short study, but they wanted to determine what is the age at which you really do not achieve. So what is the oldest that you can start acquiring a second language that you really cannot get native-like command? And so very surprisingly, they found something crazy like 18 years or something like that. So much later than we expected. And so there is hope that we can learn. But the truth is that we used to think of languages as monoliths in the sense that you can either know it or you cannot know it. And now we know that this is not really true, because languages have different components. You have the sound system, you have the lexicon, and you have the rules. And your plasticity to acquiring this is different. Because, for instance, it's very intuitive. Think about older people trying to acquire a new language. What's the hardest? The sounds, right? We do not sound like a native. This is the hardest for us to grasp. But we can, in principle, learn the lexicon. And there are tons of studies that show that you can acquire a lexicon that is native-like, because that's just word learning, right? You can do that. In the case of grammar, there is a little bit more and more of, well, actually, there is now a ton of work, partly in my group, that shows that it will depend, crucially, it will depend on the structure. If you have something close or relatively close in your language, even if it's not identical, you have an edge. You can achieve native-like processing. If you have something that is entirely different, then you typically do not achieve native-like processing. But it also is important to bear in mind that I don't need to be like a native as long as I am good enough. I don't speak like an English native speaker. I have a clear accent, I make mistakes, but I hope that you all followed what I was able to convey. I conveyed what I hope is a complex and rich message. And so there is no need to be a native if you manage, but if you don't manage, that's fine, as long as you get to whatever you need to or you want to get.
Very interesting study I wasn't aware of. So it's not puberty anymore that marks this critical period, this window of opportunity, right? It's a bit. It
was older, yes. It was very surprising. Yes, it was a very crude study because they only had a few items, but it was really interesting. Yes.
And you said 18 years old instead.
Yeah, I think it was like 18 or 20 even. I don't remember. It was a lot. Yes.
Excellent. So Eva Pelayo asks the following question, cognizant that is not your topic specifically, but how different is a trilingual kid from a bilingual one?
That's a good question. It is not my specialty, but I would say that in terms of milestones, it's the same. It's just that so one key thing to acquiring a language is exposure. If you have enough exposure, you will acquire it. But if you do not have enough exposure, then it is logical that the ones that you have more exposure in, you will be dominant in, and the other one, you might know less. But still, if you are able to roughly give them sufficient exposure in all of them, they should be able to be trilingual. And actually, this is the truth for so many people in the world. As Pedro was saying earlier, being monolingual is rare. Actually, the norm is being bilingual, but not only bilingual. In many, many communities, they are trilingual, quadrilingual, right? They don't use them all in the same context. It's not like we're expecting to be able to write essays for university in all of these languages. Maybe one is the one that you use when you go to the market. And then another one is the one that you use with your family that lives wherever. But you have enough competence to communicate in all of those languages. And so in principle, you can acquire.
Excellent. Pedro Cuesta, our very director, asks the following. In bilingual families, do we have any studies investigating why, on occasion, children only want to speak one of the languages? Is this perhaps due to the fact they do not want to be seen as different from the rest of the children who might be monolingual in their environment, for instance, at school, in the playground, and so on?
Yes, so I cannot tell you specific studies because I work on babies up until age 9-12 months. But I can tell you that the reasons that we know this happens is what I was commenting on earlier, right? So we have, this is a very good vision, what you mentioned, things like fitting in, right? Why am I the weird one? That is very important, but also just laziness, right? It's like if I am, because if you, again, exposure, don't get the same amount of exposure, if you are overwhelmingly surrounded by one language, this is the one that is easiest for you, you have more vocabulary, and so you don't want to bother making the effort because your parents also understand this language, right? And so why will I make the effort to speak this other language when I can use this and they understand? And so very often this is what I see in older kids. And so that's why it's important to have further context in which they use it, so that it's normalized that this is also your language, you should take pride on it and want to use it. But of course, poor kids, right? They do what they can.
Absolutely, Irene. While people write more questions, I have actually a question for you, which is more of a comment. It's not specific to your talk, but I think definitely it's definitely connected to it in some way. So there's the issue of, you know, the definition of language for linguists, right? We always have this idea that, well, we talk about dialects, varieties, languages, but that's more of a socio-political concept. It's not a primitive for us, right? Because after all, you know, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy, as we know, right? The famous quotation. So, you know, however, we have evidence that children do distinguish between systems, right? But there is this contention that in fact, children have, you know, linguistic resources or systems of linguistic repertoires rather than, okay, language A, language B, as you said, monolithic. I don't know, what do you think of that? Because, well, there's evidence that soon enough children know that these things are separate, right? They decide they don't want to use one because I'm not cool, I'm the outcast, this is alien to my friend, so why would I speak this language? And then I impose the majority, the prevailing language, as you said, at home, for instance. I don't know, what's your view on that? It's a genuine...
I think that is this, in the same way that you can be bilingual, you can be dialectal, perfectly fine. As we've seen, the babies that I showed you earlier, by 4 or 5 months, they can tell apart British English from American English, right? So we do have the tools to acquire one or more dialects perfectly fine. And there are studies looking into bidialectals and to what extent this relates to bilingualism or not. And this is something that is being studied, right? And so, yes, actually, let's say we're hypersensitive to this, because there was a study not that long ago by Judith Kroll that I thought was quite interesting that showed that actually, so they were testing the ability to acquire a second language or something specific about learning a language from adults that were living, so they only spoke one language, and they were either living in places in which only one language was spoken or places that were highly bilingual. They were not bilingual, but they were places in which they would, you know, here and there hear things. And they actually found differences in how they were processing this new input. They found that those that were in bilingual context were, let's say, more easy to acquire or to learn this thing that they were teaching them. Very interesting. Still, like, I think they have to work more on this, but this is still very promising. It shows you how apt we are at, you know, learning and observing our surroundings. So I don't see why dialects in that sense, if they are, you know, different, why a kid will not be able, and actually if they can, there are bidialectal infants. Yeah.
Right, and this is again just a follow-up thought. If we think of, for instance, the Spanish of Asturias, which is influenced by Asturian, but Asturian and Spanish are pretty similar, right? It's very different from Spanish and Basque, for instance. I'm thinking of dialects of Arabic, for instance, which are not mutually intelligible and in fact should be called languages, right? Or the languages of Italy, which are called dialects, but in reality they're historical dialects of Latin. So, but I think it's a whole fascinating thing, right? Bidialectalism, bilingualism, which are one and the same thing for many, right? Ultimately, so. But I think it's just fascinating. Anyway, sorry, I don't get carried away. Michael Hagen, I hope I pronounce Hagen properly, asks the following. A few years ago, I had a Spanish teacher who had 2 sons who were bilingual. When in the UK, they would not speak Spanish outside the home with their mother, from Chile, actually, because they felt different. But when in Spain, they actually were out on the streets and they were speaking Spanish fluently to everyone, no problem. It's a comment, but what do you think regarding in light of the previous stuff?
Yes, it does not surprise me as long as they kept on having input at home. They kept on having input, right? So what is enough and what is not enough depends on a lot of things, like on a specific context, on the specific kid. It depends on whether both parents speak the same language or not, because if you have both parents speaking Spanish, then at home you only really hear Spanish. If only one of your parents speaks Spanish, but the other one speaks another language, then your kid is having half the exposure, right? Particularly if outside you don't speak Spanish. So of course, there are a lot of very different scenarios that can play. Yes. And also, it's just that even if they lost the language, you truly do not lose it entirely always, right? There are these cool studies with adoptees that I thought were really fantastic, which these were babies that had been brought to Canada, I think it was, from Korea, if I'm not mistaken, when they were, let's say, 1 year of age. And so they had no memory of Korean, and they were tested when they were adults, and they were trying to be taught some contrasting Korean, and they turned out to be somewhat better than the English speakers that had never heard it before. And they had not heard this in their entire life, except for that first year of life. But something remained. It wasn't a lot. Eventually, the English speakers caught up. But I mean, something lingers, right? So if you have consistently been acquiring this language at home from your mother, particularly, generally, the mother is the one that gives more input, right? So what happens, because you spend more time with her and she's nursing you and all of this, what happens is that it's not easy to lose it all, but you have to train it.
I actually have an anecdote from a former professor of mine during my doctoral studies in Connecticut, Italian. The wife was Italo-American, so the kids, they spoke English and Italian at home, but the children really refused to speak Italian. And this is, you know, based on Michael's comment and your follow-up. After 12 years, okay, so we are talking about puberty, basically, they went to Italy. And one summer they saw the kid, the one that was 12 years old, playing with other kids on the beach, right? And in the sand. And they went there, they were like, what the hell is going on? I mean, she's communicating with them. She never spoke the very first word of Italian in front of them, even though obviously she was a receptive bilingual in the sense that they would talk to her in Italian and she would act accordingly. So the language was there, but they never ever heard her say a word. In other words, she didn't get any practice in Italian. So they went there, you know, kind of carefully, and they were eavesdropping, right? And they actually heard her speak perfect Italian with the grandparents' accent from, I think it was Calabria, perfect Italian. Never had the child gotten a chance to practice.
Yes, yeah.
And look, fully bilingual, but just in a very kind of subconscious, invisible way, right?
And this brings it back to the point I was making from the beginning. Aren't kids amazing? Aren't they amazing that they can do this just so quickly? I think there's no topic more beautiful than this.
Well, I must say I agree with you, Irene. It's a big miracle, and we need to explain it as scientists, and that's why we approach it from a scientific viewpoint, right?
Yes.
Marcela has another question. Marcela Fritzler, what can you recommend? What you can recommend is to negotiate the linguistic rebellion that will take place in the new social contexts of the child, the kindergarten, for example. And in addition to the myth of teachers who consider that bilingualism can create difficulties in school. Sorry, I didn't do the intonation right, so I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment. What can you recommend?
So about the negotiating part, so 2 points on this. The first one is, I hope that less and less people are now trying to sell the point that being bilingual is bad. Because so in the recent years, what's been is a wave of studies showing to the contrary. And if not, it doesn't need to be better than knowing one language. It's just not worse. And because it is not worse, and as Pedro was saying earlier, it's just culturally richer. Why would you deprive yourself of having two things, you know, from having two things when you can have them and it brings no difficulty, no problem to you? So I hope that nobody is by now still claiming that learning two languages brings delays, because there is so much evidence that it doesn't, right? So that's the first thing. But then the second thing was, how do you negotiate, right? So if it's a matter of negotiating with whoever is a caregiver, if you go to La Crèche or whatever, that I cannot give you, because that will depend on where you are going, right? Whether you can tell them or encourage them to use a language or another. About discussing with your kid or negotiating with your kid, that's something that needs, as we say in Spanish, you need to have some left hand, right? You need to be smart about how you try to convince your kid to use their language, because forcing them is not going to make them develop love for their language. And that is what you want, right? So you want them to love the fact that they have another language and the fact that they can use both of them. So try and find things that are enjoyable for them to do. Maybe, I don't know, activities that otherwise they wouldn't do, or try and find a friend, or maybe a babysitter that is super cool and speaks that language, whatever it makes them love it. That is the point. That is the one thing that will work, is that they appreciate it.
There's a comment by Magdalena Palucha, which confirms some of the research that has been mentioned in different talks throughout. I've been working with bilingual, trilingual children for 10 years. These children make better progress at school than children who speak just one language. So, well, I don't think
that's precisely what Kim was showing in her talk, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Margaret Lee Chapman asks the following question. This is in the context of trying to learn two languages simultaneously, concurrently. One seems to take precedence over the other. Is it better to learn one at a time to prevent confusion, or should they just be learned side by side?
You mean as an infant? No, side by side is perfectly fine. There is no confusion. Kids do not confuse. There's lots of evidence of that. One thing is that they might use, so you might think they're confused because they might use words. Imagine they might be speaking in English and use the words in Spanish. But that is because, as I said, they do not know all of their words in their two languages. It might be that I don't know, they only ever have heard the word frame and they want to say Marco and they just don't have it. And so they'll use frame because, as we said, we are efficient machines. We will use our resources. But we know there are lots of studies showing that we actually do not mix them. We only mix, so we don't confuse them. We mix them systematically. There is an order to what we do. There is a logic to what we do. And they very quickly start reacting to whoever they have in front of them, meaning that if they have parents that mix their languages, kids tend to mix their languages. If they interact with people that do not mix their languages, they tend not to mix their languages. And they can do this simultaneously. So they can, at the same time, talk to people and mix their language because this is the interlocutor they have, and with other people, not do it. So we, again, are just efficient and we use the resources that we have. So in principle, there's no evidence that they are confused. The earlier they start learning both, the better they will acquire them. The more naturally, the more easily. So I don't see any reason to recommend doing sequential acquisition because most likely the second one is not going to be dominant. Yes.
Even though we are aware that you are an expert on child language acquisition, first languages rather, what do you think would be the case? What do you think would be more advisable in the case of adults trying to learn two languages? Imagine I want to learn Italian and Portuguese. Should I go and learn Italian first and then Portuguese, or should I go to classes like, you know, Monday, Wednesday, Friday Portuguese, Tuesday and Thursday Italian?
Yes, I do not have an answer to that. I'm just going to answer just anecdotally would be do one at a time. I would get so confused, but maybe not. I really cannot tell you. I don't have a scientific answer to that.
My intuition there, my hunch is that I would have more difficulty if the languages are similar, to be
very
honest.
close. Yes, if they're close languages. Yeah.
Mandarin and Italian, maybe I can really see them as two different things, but Portuguese and Italian, like more Roman life. No, please.
I tend to agree.
Excellent. Yes. Good. So I think we are running out of time, but there is, of course, time for a brief, quick question. Otherwise, I will let Pedro adjourn the meeting and maybe ask some last-minute question. Otherwise, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Irene. Oh, there's a last-minute question. If a child by Lydia Costa, sorry about that. It's very, you inspired everyone, so price we pay. If a child understands everything in one language, for instance, Spanish at home with one of the parents, but responds in English, to what extent can we consider that child fully bilingual?
I mean, the kid understood, therefore it is a bilingual. The kid understood what if the baby is, or the kid is replying correctly, the kid has understood what you said. It's just that the kid doesn't want to make the effort or is more comfortable at, or whatever, in speaking that other language. But if they don't understand at all, again, what do you mean by bilingual? So there is this big range of what we mean. But if you're speaking in one language and they're providing the correct answer in another language, this kid understands the first language because they responded correctly, right? It's just, as I said, it's very difficult. I don't have a right answer of how to do this, but you need to foster their appreciation of the other one so that they will want to talk in that language, right? So that's why I think always maybe having peers of that age, that is not only the parents or peers that are of their age that they can play with in that language, that is potentially a good thing, or or watching movies in that language, something that is fun for them, that is different, and that allows them to, keep on hearing it and keep on practicing it.
What to say? Really fantastic. I think we are really very emotional at the same time, because I think some of the public, or the majority, had the experience of bilingual realities, as we mentioned, bilingual families. And it shows only that the richness is to learn, to know different languages, to different cultures, and to have different lives, because at the end of the day, with each language, you have a new and enriching life, and you have nothing to lose. But for the children, from my experience, I don't want to speak about my personal life, but my family is bilingual, and we have always been in a third country. So the children were always with at least 3 different languages. Mm-hmm. And for the people who ask for my experience, what I can say is to bring the children to speak to you in your languages, just by storytelling, playing music, something that makes fun and that shows them that it's a real pleasure to use this language. So that is my comment. That is also what I recommend from my experience. And thank you so much, Julio, Irene. It was really great. We are very happy. And I hope to see you all again on the 12th of April with a new session of Bilingualism. Thank you. Muchas gracias y hasta pronto.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Irene. Thank you, Pedro. Thank you, everyone.